Greetings, fellow book detectives, to a new case of literary intrigue. Grab your magnifying glass as we uncover the secrets hidden within the pages of Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Part 1, Chapters 1, 2. Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is the story of Ifemelu and Obinze, two young Nigerians who are deeply in love but have dreams of a bigger life outside of Nigeria. The novel follows their stories as Ifemelu moves to America to pursue an education while Obinze travels to London when he finds himself unable to follow Ifemelu to the United States. Chapter 1 begins with Ifemelu in Princeton, waiting for a train to take her to Trenton to get her hair braided. Ifemelu likes Princeton and regrets that she has to go to Trenton to find an African hair braiding salon. As she travels to the salon, she thinks about the blog she writes and that she would normally be looking for an encounter that she could use as inspiration for a blog post. However, she is closing her blog because she is moving back to Nigeria in spite of the success she's found in America. Ifemelu arrives at Mariama African Hair Braiding, and it is a run-down shop with a broken-down air conditioner. Her braider, Aisha, questions why Ifemelu doesn't relax her hair. Ifemelu responds by saying she likes it the way God made it, and proceeds to comb through it with a comb she's brought from home. A Nigerian film is playing on the shop television, and when Aisha says she likes Nigerian films, Ifemelu thinks how good it is to hear someone say something positive about Nigeria. When Aisha learns Ifemelu is Igbo, she wants Ifemelu to talk to her two boyfriends who are Igbo and convince one of them to marry Aisha. As Ifemelu sits in the chair, she sends an email to Obinze to tell him she's moving back to Nigeria. Aisha is shocked that a woman who has been in America for 15 years would move back to Nigeria. Ifemelu casually says she's going back to America to see her man. Chapter 2 focuses on Obinze, who is sitting in the back of his expensive car in busy Lagos traffic when the email from Ifemelu arrives, which makes Obinze very happy. His wife, Kosi, calls and asks where he is, as she always does when she calls. When he arrives home, Kosi is dressed for the party they are attending at Chief's house. Chief is Obinze's employer. Kosi and Obinze talk about his day, and he thinks about how Kosi is only concerned that her life stays the way it is. Obinze is employed by Chief because he persistently hung around Chief until an opportunity presented itself and he was able to make a good business deal that led to his hiring. At the party, Kosi is approached by several people who tell her where she should take her daughter for schooling. She agrees with all of them to avoid conflict. Obinze finds himself touching his BlackBerry and wishing he could go home to send an email to Ifemelu. He remembers running into Rani Nudo at the mall and how she fawned over him because of his new wealth. When Obinze and Kosi get home from the party, Obinze is hungry, so Kosi asks their housegirl to bring him food. Kosi is very paranoid about housegirls because she is afraid they will seduce her husband. Obinze retreats into his study and listens to music he once listened to with Ifemelu while writing her an email. He makes no mention of Kosi in the message. Part 2, Chapters 3. Chapter 3 begins with Ifemelu still at the braiding shop. Mariama goes to pick up food, and while she is gone, Aisha calls her boyfriend Chijioke, who says he will come to meet Ifemelu. Ifemelu protests, and Aisha says she must speak Igbo to Chijioke, but then questions whether or not Ifemelu still knows Igbo, which offends Ifemelu. The storyline then shifts the past and focuses on Ifemelu's upbringing in Nigeria. Her mother's hair is very beautiful and a point of pride, but when Ifemelu is 10 years old, her mother cuts it all off, saying that she's been saved and the family will now begin attending a new church. After that, Ifemelu's mother is a different woman who no longer laughs or sings. Ifemelu's mother is very religious and prays for the general, who she refers to as Auntie Uju's mentor rather than admitting he's Uju's lover. Auntie Uju's relationship with the general is a source of gossip, since she is obviously living a higher lifestyle than her own income would afford. Ifemelu's mother says the gifts. Ifemelu's father is fired from his job because he refuses to call his new boss Mummy. He is unable to find work. He becomes depressed and very quiet, no longer showing off the intelligence he had once been so proud of. The family is unable to pay their rent, and the landlord comes to tell them they owe 3 months' rent. When the landlord leaves, Ifemelu's mother invites her husband to join her at church and then go with them to see Auntie Uju's new house on Dolphin Island. He refuses, and Ifemelu's mother comments that Uju's mother comments that Uju is fortunate to be able to afford such a nice house. Ifemelu points out that Auntie Uju isn't paying for the house, which irritates her mother. At church, Ifemelu gets into a disagreement with Sister Ibanabo, mainly because Sister Ibanabo reminds her of her own mother using religion to hide her own desires. When she returns home, she is scolded for embarrassing her mother. Auntie Uju talks to Ifemelu about it and reminds her she doesn't have to say everything she thinks. Chapter 4 focuses on Obinze and Ifemelu meeting for the first time. Obinze has just moved to Lagos from Nsukka, where his mother was a professor at the university. Obinze immediately fits in and becomes one of the popular boys. Obinze attends a party at Coyote's house where he is supposed to be Ginika's date, but he and Ifemelu feel an immediate connection and spend the evening talking. They become an inseparable couple after that. In Chapter 5, Ginika is preparing to move to America. Ginika doesn't want to go, but her friends think she is lucky. They gather at her house and talk about which of them is lucky enough to have their own American passport. Eminiki says he doesn't have a passport now, but his father has promised him one when he goes to America for university. The other kids know that his family could never afford to send him to America. Ifemelu doesn't want to admit to Obinze that she doesn't have a passport. Her family doesn't have as much money as the other students' families. She is only able to attend the same school because she did so well on her exams, and her father insisted she go to a good school. Obinze fits in better with the other kids than Ifemelu does. He is very knowledgeable about America and reads American books. Ifemelu sometimes feels like their relationship will end because she has so little in common with him. Ifemelu goes to Obinze's house and meets his mother. Obinze's mother is sophisticated, and she and Obinze have an atypical parent-child relationship, acting more like friends. When Obinze's mother leaves the house one day while Ifemelu is there, she and Obinze go to his bedroom and lay on his bed, kissing and touching. When Obinze's mother returns, she realizes what has been happening and takes Ifemelu aside to talk to her about safe sex, saying she must be the responsible one. Chapter 6 begins by further describing Auntie Uju's relationship with the general. Auntie Uju spends weekday evenings with the general, but is free to lounge around on the weekends because the general is with his wife. She is mindful of her looks and uses expensive products to help her skin look lighter. Her house has many amenities that Ifemelu doesn't. Ifemelu tries to convince her parents to let her stay with Uju during the week, but her father refuses even though her mother is for the idea. The landlord comes again and demands 2 years' rent. Ifemelu goes to Auntie Uju for help and is surprised to learn that Uju has no money of her own. However, she goes to the general who gives her the money. Ifemelu is worried for Uju because she is so dependent on the general. Auntie Uju becomes pregnant with the general's child. The general is happy about the baby and sends Uju to America to give birth there. Uju names the baby Dike and gives him her surname instead of the general's. The general helps throw an elaborate first birthday party for Dike and dies the next week in a plane crash. His relatives force Uju and Dike to move out of the house and they go to America. In Chapter 7, Ifemelu and Obinze are filling out forms for university. They both go to university in Nsukka to be closer to Obinze's mother. Ifemelu likes Nsukka because she feels like she fits in better there. However, the faculty is often on strike because the government fails to pay them. When Ifemelu thinks she is pregnant, Obinze's mother steps in to help and they discover she has appendicitis. Obinze's mother again cautions her to be the responsible one in the relationship. At the start of Chapter 8, Auntie Uju has been in America for 4 years. She encourages Ifemelu to come to America to continue her education there because the faculty at the university in Nsukka is on strike so often. Ginika helps Ifemelu apply to school in the Philadelphia area, and when she is accepted, Obinze tells her to go. He will follow her when he has finished university. The beginning of Chapter 9 returns to the present day with Ifemelu still having her hair braided. The women in the shop talk about a young customer who has just left. The customer has 2 children. They say that girls in America learn about sex too soon, and that would never happen in Africa. The shop is very hot and it reminds Ifemelu of her first summer in America, so the focus shifts again to the past. Ifemelu spends the first summer at Auntie Uju's house, where she forms an immediate connection with Dike, who is in first grade. He introduces her to his Hispanic babysitter. Ifemelu is confused by the term Hispanic, and it later becomes the inspiration for a blog post which is included in this chapter. Auntie Uju suggests she take care of Dike for the summer and look for work using a friend's social security number when she starts school, since she won't be able to work using her student visa. Ifemelu goes grocery shopping with Uju and notices she only buys what is on sale instead of what she needs. She also notices that Uju acts differently around white people and admonishes Ifemelu for speaking Igbo to Dike. Uju is tired and tells Ifemelu she thought her life would be better by now. Part 2, Chapters 10-16. Chapter 10 describes Ifemelu's first summer in America. She spends her days watching Dike and sitting with their neighbor, Jane, who is a young woman from Grenada. Jane tells Ifemelu the biggest difference she's seen in America is in the raising of children because it's harder to control them in America. When Jane's husband makes a pass at Ifemelu, she avoids both of them and spends her time with Dike making up game. When she discovers that Dike is not yet learning long division, she decides to teach him. Ifemelu also spends that summer discovering how different food in America is. Dike finds it strange that people in Nigeria eat bananas with peanuts. Ifemelu is also captivated by American commercials and the evening news. The evening news frightens her because there is so much reporting on crime and violence. In Nigeria, the news was full of army officers giving speeches and cutting ribbons. Auntie Uju says, Nigeria has crime too, they just don't report it. In Chapter 11, Auntie Uju tells Ifemelu she's met a Nigerian man named Bartholomew who wants to settle down. When Bartholomew comes to visit, he treats Dike with indifference and acts as though he is evaluating Uju's potential as a wife. Ifemelu does not like him. When he comments on a woman on television wearing a short dress and says, "Women in Nigeria would never dress like that," Ifemelu tells him that's not true and girls in Nigeria wear even shorter dresses. That night, Ifemelu tells Uju that in Nigeria, a man like Bartholomew wouldn't even be brave enough to talk to a woman like Uju. Uju shrugs and says he's not bad and has a good job. Auntie Uju passes her medical exams and says she'll have to take her braids out and relax her hair for interviews. Ifemelu feels like Uju has left a part of herself behind in Nigeria. Ifemelu leaves for college, and as she looks at the license and social security card of the woman she's meant to impersonate to get a job, she says to Auntie Uju that the woman doesn't look like her. Auntie Uju says it doesn't matter because to white people, they all look the same. In Chapter 12, Ginika is waiting at the bus station when Ifemelu arrives in Philadelphia. Ginika, who looks very different, speaks in Nigerian English as though trying to convince Ifemelu she hasn't changed. She tells Ifemelu that in America she is supposed to be offended by people who call her half-caste, even though that was a compliment in Nigeria. Ifemelu and Ginika go dress shopping. There are two salespeople in the store. One is black and the other is white. When they take a dress up to the cashier asks which salesperson helped them. They go through a series of questions to determine which salesperson it was. And when they leave the store, Ifemelu asks Ginika why the cashier didn't just ask if it was the black girl or the white girl. Ginika tells her that in America, they aren't supposed to notice such things. Ifemelu moves into a shabby apartment with 3 other girls. Ifemelu doesn't fit in with these girls who live with such certainty, buying things whenever they want them. She also doesn't understand some of the cultural norms. She's invited to go to a party and is surprised when her roommates don't dress up. The topic of how people in America dress becomes the topic of a blog post in which Ifemelu observes that Americans are so self-fulfilled that they don't bother about how they look to other people. Chapter 13 finds Ifemelu struggling to find employment. She has some trouble at first remembering to use the name of the persons whose identity she has borrowed. She applies for many jobs and has no luck. Ifemelu's money begins to run out, and she receives a letter telling her she must pay her tuition or her records will be frozen. When she calls Obinze and tells him this, he advised her to get on a payment plan. She finds their phone conversations calming and feels like she can just be herself with him. She also continues to call Dyke, and when she receives a piece of junk mail with her name on it, she tells Dyke about it because it makes her feel somehow less invisible. In Chapter 14, Ifemelu registers for her college classes. The woman at the registration desk speaks very slowly to Ifemelu as though she doesn't understand English. Ifemelu realizes it's because of her accent, and so begins to practice speaking with an American accent. Ifemelu finds her classes to be very easy, but still struggles to understand America. Obinze suggests she read American books to learn more. She begins to spend a great deal of time at the library, which she loves because the books are in good condition unlike in Nigeria. She writes letters to Obinze about the books she's read and finally understands the power books have over him. Obinze tells her she is starting to sound more American. In history class, Ifemelu watches Roots. The class discusses the movie and an African student asks why the word nigger was bleeped out since it's a word that has caused a lot of people pain and it's insulting to remove it. This incites a passionate discussion. Ifemelu approaches the woman who started the conversation and is invited to attend a meeting of the African Students Association, ASECI. Ifemelu feels at home at the meeting surrounded by people who understand her experience. There is also a Black Student Union, but that is for Black Americans. Ifemelu wonders which club Dyke will attend when he is in college. Auntie Uju calls Ifemelu and tells her she and Dyke are moving to Manhattan with Bartholomew. Uju says she and Bartholomew will be going to court to get married so Bartholomew can act as Dyke's legal parent. In Chapter 15, Ifemelu responds to an ad for an assistant for a tennis coach. When she meets him, she discovers he is looking for someone to help him relax with sexual favors. She tells the man she'll think about it and leaves. She continues to apply for many different jobs, including a job as a nanny for a woman named Kimberly that Ginika did some charity work with. She is unsuccessful in finding a job, and her roommates leave her notes reminding her that she needs to pay her portion of the rent. Ifemelu finally goes to the tennis coach's house in desperation and is paid for allowing him to touch her. Afterward, she falls into a deep depression and stops communicating with Obinze. Ginika calls her to ask what is going on since Obinze and Unju have been calling her. She also tells Ifemelu that Kimberly called asking for Ifemelu's number because she has decided to hire her as a babysitter. At the beginning of chapter 16, Kimberly gives Ifemelu a signing bonus because Ginika has told her about Ifemelu's recent challenges. Ifemelu is able to pay some bills and send gifts to her parents. She hasn't spoken to Obinze and deletes his emails. She tells herself she'll give herself a month to feel better and then contact him. While Ifemelu is babysitting at Kimberly's one day, a carpet cleaner arrives. He is hostile toward her at first, but changes when Ifemelu indicates she is not the homeowner. This incident is the basis for a blog post in which Ifemelu remarks that it wouldn't have mattered to the man if she'd had a lot of money. She was not his idea of the person that should own that home because of the way she looks. Ifemelu calls Auntie Uju's house to speak with Dyke, and Auntie Uju tells her that Dyke has been asking about his name. He asks if he has his mother's surname because his father didn't love him. Ifemelu suggests it's probably time to tell Dyke that Uju was not a second wife. Since moving to Manhattan, Dyke has changed. He's no longer transparent, and his grades are dropping. The school tells Uju that Dyke is aggressive and needs to go to special ed classes where they are trained to deal with him. Uju tells the school he is not aggressive and that they are blaming him just because he looks different. Part 2, Chapter 17:22. In Chapter 17, Ifemelu decides to stop faking an American accent after taking a telemarketer's comment that she sounds American as a compliment. She speaks without the fake accent for the first time when taking a train to Auntie Uju's house. While on the train, she meets a Black American man named Blaine, and they spend the trip talking. Blaine gives Ifemelu his phone number, but he never returns her calls. When Ifemelu arrives at Auntie Uju's house, Uju does nothing but complain. She is being treated badly because of her race, and she says Bartholomew is hardly ever home. Dyke seems sad, and while he and Ifemelu play soccer, he tells her that his camp counselor refused to give him sunscreen because the counselor thought he didn't need it because of his dark skin. He says he just wants to be regular like everyone else. The chapter ends with a blog post about American tribalism. Ifemelu says in her blog that there are 4 kinds of tribes in America: class, ideology, religion, and race. Chapter 18 returns to the present day. Mariama has a new customer who notices a stack of Nigerian magazines and says that Nigerians are known for being criminals. Ifemelu can tell Mariama doesn't like the woman, but when the woman complains about a broad, Mariama graciously redoes the braid. Ifemelu believes that providing customer service is part of Mariama's new American persona. Another customer comes in and tries to draw Ifemelu into a conversation, but she avoids the conversation and thinks about how it was with conversation, and thinks about how it was with Kurt that she first saw her new American self. The story again returns to the past. Kimberly introduces Kurt and Ifemelu. The two begin to date, and Kurt tells her he is wealthy and his family has been hoteliers for hundreds of years. Kimberly is happy that the two are dating. Kurt tells Ifemelu she is beautiful and he loves her body. She sometimes thinks of Obinze when they are together, but she tries not to compare them. Ifemelu is happy with Kurt, who spoils her with money and attention. In chapter 19, Ifemelu meets Kurt's mother, who is a stereotypically snobbish, wealthy woman. She compliments Ifemelu's eyelashes and Ifemelu's eyelashes, and Ifemelu thinks she must have tried very hard to find something to compliment. Ifemelu's life is going well. She is working toward raising her G-pop. Kurt buys her gifts, purchases her groceries and textbooks, and sends her gift certificates for department store. He asks her to give up babysitting to spend more time with him, but she says no. Graduation is drawing near, but Ifemelu isn't certain what she wants to do. Kurt sets up an interview for her with a company that will help her get a work visa and start the process to get a green card. In preparation for the interview, Ifemelu removes her braids and relaxes her hair. The chemicals burn her scalp, and Kurt is upset that she's done this to herself. She does well at the interview and wonders if things would have gone so well if she'd gone in with her natural hair. The chapter concludes with a blog post about how everyone in America aspires to be a wasp. But what then do wasps aspire to? Chapter 20 starts with Ifemelu living in Baltimore. Ifemelu has her own apartment, but she spends most of her time at Kurt's. She continues to relax her hair, and it begins to fall out of the temples. Wambui convinces her to cut her hair and let it go natural. Ifemelu cuts her hair very short and hates it. She is embarrassed by her hair and calls in sick to work the next day. Ifemelu uses Kurt's laptop to look up information about caring for her hair and finds suggestive emails from a white woman Kurt met at a conference. He says nothing has happened, and the woman knows he has a girlfriend. Ifemelu is hurt and points out that all of his old girlfriends have long flowing hair. She leaves. Kurt later comes to her apartment and they reconcile. Ifemelu calls in sick for 3 days due to her hair. She begins visiting a website called Happily Kinkinappy and finds inspiration for learning to like her natural hair. One day, when she and Kurt are at a farmer's market, a black man walks by and quietly asks if she ever wonders why Kurt likes her looking all jungle like that. That night, she considers buying a straight weave, but remembers a post on Happily Kinkinappy, and decides against it. She goes home and writes a post on the website's board about the incident and receives many supportive comments. She finally falls in love with her hair. The chapter ends with a blog post titled, "Why Dark-Skinned Black Women, Both American and Non-American Love, Barack Obama." In the post, she says that black men like their women to be lighter-skinned, but Obama married a woman who is not light-skinned, so women like him. Chapter 21 begins on a Sunday morning with a call from Auntie Uju complaining about what Dyke wants to wear to church. Uju is certain they will be talked about if he doesn't dress properly, and she's been telling him to tone it down in school so he doesn't look so different. Ifemelu convinces Dyke to wear the shirt his mother has chosen and says she'll bring Kurt to meet him on the weekend. Kurt is charming with Auntie Uju in a way that makes Ifemelu think he's performing, and she realizes she doesn't like charming. Dyke and Kurt go outside to play basketball, and Auntie Uju tells Ifemelu she can see that Kurt really likes Ifemelu even with her afro hair. Ifemelu tells Uju to leave her hair alone and says that if women with natural hair appeared in magazines and movies, Uju would be praising her hair. Uju asks Ifemelu if she's read Dyke's essay and says she wonders how he can say he is conflicted and that even his name is difficult. Ifemelu urges Uju to talk to Dyke about how he is feeling. Uju goes on to say she's tired, and that Bartholomew insists she make him dinner every night and is demanding that she give him her salary because he's the head of the family. One morning, Auntie Uju and Bartholomew argue, and she calls Ifemelu to tell her that she is leaving him. U and Dyke are moving to Willow, which is near the university. Uju tells Ifemelu Dyke is happy to be leaving and didn't even mention Bartholomew. The blog post at the end of the chapter is about how non-American blacks become black when they come to America, and along with that comes all of the stereotypes and racial issues. In chapter 22, Ifemelu runs into Coyote in a mall. Coyote tells her Obinze asked him to look her up and she feels numb at the mention of Obinze's name. Coyote tells her Obinze's name. Coyote tells her Obinze's is in England and she feels betrayed to find out. There have been changes to his life that she didn't know about. She tells Coyote she is with her boyfriend and walks away. She tells Kurt she ran into a friend from high school but won't say more. He asks if it was an old boyfriend because she seems upset. She says not, but refuses to explain. Later that day, she sends Obinze an email apologizing for her silence. He does not reply. Kurt tells Ifemelu he's booked her a massage. She thanks him and tells him he is a sweetheart. He responds forcefully that he doesn't want to be a sweetheart, he wants to be the love of her life. Part 3, chapters 23-26. In chapter 23, the focus of the novel shifts to Obinze's past when he lived in London. He is not there legally, so he cannot work. He meets the Angolans and pays them to arrange a marriage for him so that he can get his papers. He meets the girl he is to marry, Cleotilde, a few days later and assures he will make the process as easy as possible for her. Obinze realizes Cleotilde is attracted to him and he asks her for her phone number. The Angolans say he should call them. Obinze gives Cleotilde his number and asks her if she'd like to get together with him so they can get to know each other. She says yes. The two get together over the next few weeks and practice for the immigration interview. Cleotilde tells Obinze the Angolans didn't give her much money, but she knows Obinze doesn't have any more money and she wants to do this for him. As Obinze waits in line at the marriage registration office, he thinks about having gone to the American embassy in Lagos to get an American visa. The storyline flashes back to how Obinze came to be in England. Obinze tries several times to get a visa to go to America and be with Ifemelu. When he cannot, his mother puts Obinze on her visa application so that he can accompany her as her research assistant and then live with his cousin Nicholas. Once in England, Obinze takes a job cleaning bathrooms, but quits when he walks into a stall to find someone has defecated on a toilet lid. He feels like the person who has done this was staging a performance somehow, and it makes him feel small. That evening, he receives the email Ifemelu sent after seeing Coyote. Nicholas and his wife, Ojiogo, have changed a great deal since they lived in Nigeria. They are not longer outrageous, fun-loving people. Instead, they worry excessively about their children receiving a good education and are careful about only speaking English to them. Obinze and Ojiogo have a conversation about accents, and Obinze wonders if Nigerians are more forgiving of their children raised in England because they have foreign accents. Chapter 25 talks about what drew Obinze to be friends with Emenike when they were in high school. Emenike was a sharp boy who was eager to be seen as someone who knew things and was of a higher class than he really was. He enjoyed reading books. So he and Obinze became friends who talked about books, played Scrabble, and exchanged knowledge. Emenike moved to England during one of the university strikes. Obinze calls Emenike when he arrives in England, but Emenike puts him off repeatedly saying he is busy with work and travel. Obinze realizes Emenike has changed and will not help him get an I number so he can work. He calls another friend, Iloba, who has always treated Obinze as a kinsman. Iloba puts Obinze in touch with a man named Vincent, who agrees to let Obinze use his NI number in exchange for 35% of his pay. In Chapter 26, Obinze is working at various jobs under the name of Vincent. He works a job in a warehouse where Roy Snell, an Englishman, is his boss. Roy treats him kindly, and Obinze fits in well with the other workers. He develops a friendship with an Englishman named Nigel, who shows him around London. One day, Nigel and Obinze deliver a refrigerator to an elderly, disheveled man. Nigel refers to the man as a real gent in an odd tone, in spite of the fact that the kitchen is dirty and the man looks hungover. Obinze realizes that Nigel's reaction has to do with the man's accent, and that if he had spoken differently, Nigel would have complained about not receiving a tip. Part 3, chapters 27-30. In chapter 27, Obinze is in a bookshop cafe enjoying his weekly treat of an expensive coffee and reading American fiction and American newspapers. He avoids the British newspapers because the articles about immigration frighten him. A woman and her son come into the bookshop and sit by him. Obinze's conversation with the woman leaves him thinking about love and Ifemelu, so he texts a woman, Tendai, that he once met at a party. Tendai had offered to help him get his papers, but he knows she would convince herself they didn't just marry for the papers. While on the train on his way to Tendai's, he sees a woman reading a newspaper article about immigration and wonders if she thinks he's illegal. Later, on a train to Essex, he notices the car is filled with Nigerians, and it makes him think of the life he had imagined for himself, and he suddenly feels very lonely. In chapter 28, Obinze arrives at the warehouse where he works, and everyone is acting strangely toward him. He's sure they figured out he is illegal. Nigel runs up behind him and shoves a paper hat on his head and wishes him a happy birthday. He hadn't even thought to memorize Vincent's birth date. The men gather in the coffee room and celebrate with him. That night, Vincent calls and demands 45% of Obinze's pay. Obinze decides to ignore his demands. A week later, Roy calls Obinze into his office and says he received a call telling him Obinze is illegal and working under someone else's name. Roy tells him to bring his passport in. Obinze leaves the warehouse for the last time, wishing he'd told Roy and Nigel his real name. Years later, Obinze calls Nigel and offers him the job as his general manager in Nigeria. Chapter 29 returns to the timeline in which Obinze met Cleotilde. The Angolans call and ask him for more money. Obinze decides to call Imanike. Obinze decides to call Eminike and ask him for help. Eminike agrees to help him and asks to meet with Obinze. They meet at a restaurant. Eminike apologizes for not seeing Obinze sooner, but says he was busy with work and travel. He tells Obinze many stories about his wonderful life and work. The work stories are all about someone underestimating Eminike and Hemnike and him coming out on top. He finally gives Obinze an envelope of money, and it's double the amount Obinze asked for. Georgina, Eminike's wife, calls and invites Obinze to join them for dinner. During dinner, Georgina invites Obinze to a party at their home. When Obinze arrives at their home a little early for the party, Eminike takes him into the study where there are many pictures of Eminike posing in front of landmarks around the world. Obinze believes Eminike had the pictures taken in anticipation of the people who would see them. The party guests are all people with important jobs and interesting lives. They discuss a charity one guest, Alexa, is involved in that is trying to keep the UK from hiring so many African health workers. She says African doctors should stay in Africa because they owe it to their country. Another guest says that means that English doctors should take responsibility for the poor towns in the north of England. This upsets Alexa. During dinner, the conversation turns to immigration. Georgina says America has its own immigration problems. One guest points out that in America, immigration comes with race issues because immigrants in America are generally not white. Eminiki says that in America, blacks and whites work together, but don't play together, and that in England it is just the opposite. Obinze says he believes class hierarchy is prevalent in England and everyone seems to know their place. In England, he says, a white boy and black girl who have grown up in the same working-class town can get together without race being an issue. However, in America, race would be an issue even if they were of the same class. The conversation continues, and the guests agree that England should remain open to people fleeing from wars and poverty. Obinze doesn't think they would understand why people like him might want to run from choicelessness. Chapter 30 begins with Nicholas giving Obinze a suit for his wedding. They arrive at the Civic Center and are met by police. The police approach Obinze and tell him his passport is expired. They handcuff him and take him away. When a lawyer arrives to speak with Obinze, he tells Obinze the government has a strong case. Obinze says he is willing to return to Nigeria. He feels inhuman, like a thing to be removed. While in detention, waiting to be deported, Obinze hears other men talking about how they have been deported before and will try again. Obinze's mother calls him and says she will meet him in Lagos. Obinze is then transferred to a cell in Dover where the conditions are worse. The cell is small and cold and he is only allowed outside to exercise and eat. He becomes depressed and unable to eat. When he finally arrives in Lagos, an immigration officer demands money from him, and Obinze gives him what is in his pocket. Obinze's mother is waiting outside. Part 4, Chapters 31-35. Chapter 31 shifts back to Ifemelu's past. She has just broken up with Kurt after having cheated on him with a man who lives in her apartment complex. She tells Jinika the relationship just didn't feel right. Ifemelu tries to reconcile with Kurt, but he will not talk to her. She finally accepts the end of the relationship and thinks there must be something wrong with her. She feels like she doesn't completely know herself. Years later, when she is dating Blaine, she attends a dinner party with him. One Haitian woman says she once dated a white man and race was never an issue. Ifemelu tells the woman that is not true and that she only said it because she wishes it were true. Ifemelu says that race doesn't matter when two people who love each other are alone, but as soon as they are with other people, it does matter. They don't tell their white partners how they really feel about certain issues. Ifemelu goes on to recount stories of her relationship with Kurt in which he sometimes overreacted to perceived racism and at other times didn't see actual racism as it was occurring. The chapter ends with a blog post titled "A Michelle Obama Shout Out Plus Hair" as a race metaphor. The post talks about how a girlfriend of hers thought Michelle Obama's hair grew in straight the way she wears it. Ifemelu goes on to write about how the before and after pictures of black women in makeovers always show natural hair in the before pictures and straightened hair in the after pictures. She writes that if Michelle Obama were to appear on television with her natural hair, Obama would probably lose the independent vote. In Chapter 32, Auntie Uju tells Ifemelu she has joined African Doctors for Africa and met a man named Kweku, who is also a doctor. She says he treats her like a princess and reminds her that Kurt treated her that way, too. Kweku also treats Dyke well, which makes Ifemelu like him. When Ifemelu tells Dyke she has broke up with Kurt, He asks her if she'll be okay and brings her a tray with a banana and a can of peanuts on it. Ifemelu talks to her parents on the phone and they plan a visit to America. When they arrive, they feel like strangers to her. After they leave America, Ifemelu lies on her bed and cries uncontrollably. A short time later, she resigns from her job. Chapter 33 begins by talking about how Ifemelu's blog has grown. She has gained many readers and is receiving donations from people who want to support the blog. She is also being paid to advertise on her blog. She is immersed in the blog and checks her email often and eagerly. Ifemelu also begins being invited to speak at diversity conferences. After her first diversity conference, where she speaks honestly and in the way she does on her blog, she is called a racist and realizes that the people who read her blog are not the people who attend the conferences. She comes to the conclusion that the objective of a diversity conference is to leave the audience feeling good about themselves. Eventually, Ifemelu feels consumed by her blog and speaking engagements. She has become known simply as the blogger and feels like she's become the blog itself. In Chapter 34, Ifemelu is attending a blogging conference where she runs into Blaine, the man she met years earlier on the train. He remembers her, and they begin to email and call one another. He visits her in Baltimore, and the two quickly become lovers. At the end of his visit, Ifemelu returns to New Haven with him. She learns that he eats only organic food, exercises daily, and seems carefully disciplined. He even eats food he doesn't like just because it is good for him. Blaine's best friend, Araminta, comes for a visit. She was one of the only other black students in Blaine's high school. She tells Ifemelu she is glad that Ifemelu isn't an academic like Blaine's other friends and warns her not to take Shan, Blaine's sister, too seriously. Ifemelu moves in with Blaine after a year of dating. He shows interest in her blog and she's pleased at first, but then he tells her she needs to add more depth and that she has a responsibility since people read her blog as cultural commentary. Blaine makes Ifemelu feel like he is always trying to teach her something and is disappointed that she hasn't learned enough. One day, Blaine and Ifemelu are at a grocery store and an older white woman tells Ifemelu her hair is beautiful. Ifemelu lets the woman sink her hands into her afro and Blaine is appalled. He asks how Ifemelu could let someone do that, and Ifemelu asks him how else the woman will know what hair like hers feels like. The chapter ends with a blog post about who racists are. Ifemelu posits that Americans think racism exists, but racists are all gone. In Chapter 35, Sean calls Blaine to tell him she's in New York for the publishing of her first book. Blaine asks Ifemelu to go with him to visit her. Ifemelu says she will and asks what Sean does. Blaine tells her that Sean has done many things and had lots of experiences. He concludes that Sean is a really special person. When Ifemelu meets Sean, she notes that it seems like all of the air in the room leaves when Sean enters. She commands attention, but barely acknowledges Ifemelu. However, when Sean finally introduces herself, Ifemelu can't help feeling drawn to her. Sean receives a call from a Frenchman and ignores the call. She tells Blaine that the caller is a rich Frenchman who wants to date her. She says that it's nice that in Europe men look at black women as women and not black, but says she still doesn't want to date a white man. Blaine nods in agreement. But Ifemelu knows that if anyone else had said these things, he'd have analyzed their words and disagreed. Sean goes on to say that white men in America don't want to date black women. Ifemelu disagrees and says she gets more attention from white men. Sean dismisses her by saying that's just because she's from Africa. Ifemelu resents that Blaine agrees with Sean so readily. Nonetheless, she wants Sean to like her and invites her to be a guest blogger. The chapter closes with a blog post titled, "Obama can win only if he remains the magic Negro." The post focuses on Obama's pastor and says that Obama can win only if he remains the wise, kind black man who never gets angry and forgives racism. Part 4, chapters 36-41. In chapter 36, Blaine and Ifemelu are at a surprise birthday party for a friend of Blaine's. Although Ifemelu and Blaine have been together for over a year, Ifemelu still doesn't feel like she belongs with Blaine's friends. Blaine's friends are academics, and Ifemelu tells Blaine they aren't intellectuals because they aren't curious. Instead, they develop specialized knowledge and are stuck there. Blaine is defensive at first, but later his tone changes when he talks to Ifemelu about his friends as though he can tell she's not comfortable with them. During the party, Blaine's ex-girlfriend, Paula, reads Ifemelu's blog post titled "Friendly Tips for the American Non-Black: How to React to an American Black Talking About Blackness." The post talks about how Americans who are not black shouldn't try to make their lives sound worse when an American black is talking about an experience. She goes on to say that American blacks don't want things to be about race, so when something is about race, it probably is. The party guests watch Obama announce his candidacy for president. Ifemelu is asked what she thinks of Obama, and she says she likes Hillary Clinton. The chapter ends with a blog titled "Traveling While Black." The blog talks about the book a friend is writing about his experiences traveling the world as an American black. Chapter 37 starts with Ifemelu reflecting on how it seems Dyke has changed so quickly. He's become a tall young man who plays basketball at his high school, has a blonde girlfriend, and hangs out with a group of friends. She notices that when Dyke is with his friends, he is a different person who is full of swagger. Sean has a party, she calls a salon, and it's the first one Ifemelu has been to, so she is nervous. Sean tells everyone about her book and says it is a memoir about growing up the only black kid in her prep school, as well as other things that happened as she was growing up. Her editor has asked her to make changes to the book so that it transcends race. Sean says that black people can't write honestly about race in America. She also dismissively says that Ifemelu can get away with writing her blog because she's African and therefore writing from the outside. Ifemelu is disappointed in herself for agreeing with Sean. The blog post at the end of this chapter is about the way people refer to Obama as biracial because his mother was white. She wonders if Obama can really ever be anything but black because race is about how you look, not about your blood. Chapter 38 begins by talking about Boubacar, Ifemelu's friend, who is a Senegalese professor at Yale. She finds him intelligent and charming, but Blaine doesn't like him. Boubacar tells Ifemelu about a fellowship at Princeton and encourages her to apply. Ifemelu is invited to a luncheon for a professor leaving on sabbatical, and she accepts the invitation. Blaine sends Ifemelu a text asking if she's heard about Mr. White, the security guard at the library. When Ifemelu and Blaine meet, he tells her that Mr. White, a black man, was arrested on suspicion of drug dealing when he met a friend outside of the library to lend the man his car. The man gave Mr. White some money he owed him, and a library employee who saw the exchange assumed they were dealing drugs. Blaine says that Mr. White is fine and has returned to work, but thinks it's sad that Mr. White seems to expect things like this to happen. Blaine organizes a protest about Mr. White's arrest and assumes Ifemelu will be there. Ifemelu goes to the luncheon she was invited to instead, and Blaine becomes angry. He tells her she can't just write her blog like it's a game. She has to live it. Ifemelu apologizes. But when Blaine refuses to talk to her for 3 days, she packs a bag and goes to Auntie Uju's. At the start of chapter 39, Ifemelu is at Auntie Uju's and is eating non-organic chocolate. Uju tells her that Dyke has been accused of hacking the school's computer system, but Dyke couldn't have done it because he's not even good with computers. Dyke says he's being accused because he's black. He later tells Ifemelu, though, that other kids sometimes ask him for weed and say, "What's up, bro?" to him, which he thinks is ridiculous. After 9 days, Blaine finally agrees to see Ifemelu. They cook coconut rice together, and he is still cold and distant, but Ifemelu wraps her arms around him anyway. The chapter ends with a blog post explaining the meaning of tribalism, diversity, and culture in America. As chapter 40 begins, Ifemelu and Blaine are back together, but her feelings for him have changed. Although she still admires him, there is no passion left in the relationship. The one thing that unites them is their agreement on Barack Obama, whom Ifemelu changed her mind about after reading Obama's book. Ifemelu receives an email from Princeton offering her the research fellowship. She tells Blaine she won't move until after the election. Blaine volunteers for Obama's campaign and tells her about an old black woman he met who told him she didn't think a black man would be president even in her grandchild's lifetime. Ifemelu writes a blog about the woman. When Obama becomes the nominee for the Democratic Party, Blaine and Ifemelu make love for the first time in weeks. Blaine becomes depressed after Obama delivers a speech on race in response to negative comments made by his pastor. Blaine is disheartened by the speech because it seems like it's meant to close the discussion on race, not open it, but Obama had to do so to be elected. A call from Sean's boyfriend, a video, helps break Blaine out of his depressed state. A video says Sean has had a nervous breakdown. Ifemelu feels angry at Sean because it seems like she is just attention-seeking. About a month before this, Ifemelu had seen Sean and Sean had said she knew that Blaine and Ifemelu would get back together after their argument, but she said it in a way that made it clear she didn't think Ifemelu was right for Blaine. When Ifemelu had tried to change the subject by talking about Obama, Sean had turned the conversation back to herself and her book. Ifemelu wished Sean would realize everything wasn't about her. When Obama is elected, Ifemelu receives a text from Dyke that says, "I can't believe it. My president is black like me." Chapter 41 returns to the present day with Ifemelu in the braiding shop. Ifemelu is starting to be bothered by the stuffy, shabby shop and wonders why these African women can't keep the shop clean and ventilated. Then, her attitude changes and she feels a connection with Aisha when Aisha tells her that she couldn't even go to her father's funeral because she didn't have her papers. Ifemelu tries to comfort Aisha and tells her she'll go to visit Aisha's boyfriend at his work to talk to him about marrying Aisha. When Ifemelu's hair is finished, she leaves. While she's on the train, Auntie Uju calls and tells her Dyke has tried to commit suicide. Ifemelu tells Uju she'll be there the next day. Part 5, Chapter 42, and Part 6, Chapter 43. Chapter 42 is set in the present time with Obinze eagerly waiting for Ifemelu's return to Nigeria. It's been an unusually long time between her emails, and Obinze worries that she may have changed her mind. Since they've re-established communication, Obinze has written Ifemelu many emails detailing his life, including the death of his mother. Ifemelu had replied quickly to the email about his mother and said she had sometimes wished Obinze's mother were her own. Ifemelu had asked for his phone number but hadn't called. Obinze had been certain she still had feelings for him since she'd felt so strongly about his mother. Obinze's last email had expressed his feelings for Ifemelu, but he regretted it after sending it. Ifemelu finally emails back and explains that Dyke tried to commit suicide and she is postponing her return to Nigeria. Obinze immediately considers flying to America to be with her, but knows he cannot. Kosi and Obinze visit a potential school for Buchi. Obinze's mind wanders to Ifemelu, but Kosi thinks he is thinking about work. Obinze reads all of Ifemelu's archived blog posts and feels a sense of loss because he feels like he's missed so much of Ifemelu's life. In chapter 43, Ifemelu is staying with Dike after his suicide attempt. She stays close by him, but they don't discuss the attempt. She feels a sense of blame toward Auntie Uju. She believes Uju brushed off Dike's attempts to identify as black. She tells Auntie Uju she shouldn't have done that. She says Uju spent too much time telling Dike who he isn't, but never told him about who he is. Uju says she only did that because she didn't want him to act like the other kids, and says the attempt was because of depression. Ifemelu says the depression was caused by the situation. When Dike is doing better, Ifemelu takes him to Miami for his birthday. They spend a few days in a hotel ordering burgers and lounging by the pool. Finally, Dike tells Ifemelu she should go to Nigeria now. He will be all right. She says he should come and visit her there. He thinks for a moment and then says yes. Part 7, chapters 44-48. In chapter 44, Ifemelu returns to Lagos, Nigeria. She is struck by how dirty and rundown it is and how rude the people are. Rainudo teases her about being an Americanah and says that if she at least spoke with an American accent, they could forgive her for complaining. Rainudo is dating a married executive named Don, who helps her pay for an apartment. She tells Ifemelu she's been asking Don to buy her a Jeep for some time now. When Rainudo turns off the generator for the night, Ifemelu complains about the heat and humidity. At the beginning of chapter 45, Ifemelu is looking for a job. She applies for a job at a women's magazine called Zoe. When she meets the owner of the magazine, the woman insists her employees call her Auntie Wenyu. Auntie Wenyu hires Ifemelu and invites her to her home to talk. Ifemelu thinks this is unprofessional, but goes because she realizes things are different in Nigeria and the line between personal and professional is often blurred. She immediately begins to talk business with Auntie Wenyu and comments that a house pictured in the magazine is ugly. Auntie Wenyu disagrees and points out the size of the generator. Ifemelu is surprised she didn't notice the size of the generator because a Nigerian would notice that. As Ifemelu goes about the business of setting up her life in Nigeria, she frequently thinks she spots Obinze in the crowd, but it's never him. She still has not told him she is back. Ifemelu rents an apartment with a view of a beautiful old colonial house that has fallen into disrepair. The estate agent tells her an army officer once lived there. When Ifemelu tells Rainudo about her apartment, Rainudo says she should have contacted Obinze for help because he would have given her a deal, or maybe even a free apartment. Chapter 46 tells about Ifemelu's visits to her parents on the weekends. Neighbors and relatives come to greet her, and her mother says they are just coming in hopes Ifemelu will give them something. Ifemelu's parents talk about their visit to America, and she hopes they won't bring up Blaine because she has lied and told them work has delayed his visit to Nigeria. She also uses Blaine as a way of deflecting her old friend's talk of marriage. Ifemelu spends time with her old friends Tochi and Pry. Tochi has changed a great deal and speaks in a defensive tone. She is critical of America. Ifemelu can see Tochi is unhappy, so she only talks about the parts of America she did not like and is relieved when Tochi leaves. Pry is the same except that she's become harder and more glamorous. She is a wedding planner and believes that women shouldn't marry for love, but should marry men that can take care of them. In chapter 47, Ifemelu begins her job at Zoe magazine. She meets her co-workers Esther, who is the receptionist, and Doris and Zamayi, who are editors like Ifemelu. Esther is ingratiating and constantly invites people to her church. At first, Ifemelu is uncomfortable with her ingratiating ways because Esther is older than her, but then she realizes it has to do with status and not age. So she goes along with it. Doris has a foreign degree like Ifemelu, and she makes certain Ifemelu knows they are on the same level. She tells Ifemelu that Ifemelu will share an office with Zemaye and makes a disparaging remark about Zemaye. When Ifemelu meets Zemaye, Zemaye immediately says she hopes Ifemelu doesn't mind cold rooms because Doris keeps the air conditioner set to high. Doris snaps that the humidity is too high. In Nigeria, and she couldn't breathe when she returned. The two continue to argue about the air conditioner. Doris invites Ifemelu to attend a meeting of the Nigerian Club, a group of people who have returned from living abroad. Zemaye calls it the bin to group and says she can't go because she's never been abroad. When Doris leaves the office, Zemaye asks Ifemelu about her blog and about Blaine. Ifemelu is surprised that Auntie Winyu has shared details of her private life with the other employees. In Chapter 48, Ifemelu invited Rani Nudo to go to the Nigerian Club meeting with her. Rani Nudo declines because she's going out with a man named Ndudi, whom she likes, but isn't sure is serious about her. She asks Ifemelu to lie if Don asks because she told him she'd be out with Ifemelu. Rani Nudo hopes Don will buy her a Jeep before she breaks up with him. Ifemelu goes to the Nigerian Club meeting. She talks to some women who also have natural hair about Nigerian salons and how they all want them to use relaxers. The conversation has a self-righteous air to it. She also meets a man named Fred, who had lived in Boston. Other people join the conversation, and they all talk about things they had in America that they don't have now. Ifemelu hears someone talk about a new restaurant that has the kinds of things they can eat and becomes uncomfortable with the conversation. When Fred says he doesn't like Nollywood, Ifemelu says she does just because she feels the need to be contrary. Part 7. Chapters 49-55. As Chapter 49 begins, Ifemelu is feeling more at home in Nigeria. She is spending more time with friends, but hasn't seen Obinze yet. She thinks she needs to lose weight before she sees him, but hasn't really been trying to lose weight. She isn't happy with her job at Zoe because she feels stifled. She thinks about starting a new blog and perhaps starting her own magazine someday. She spends much of her work time interviewing society women and attending events, neither of which she finds interesting. One day in a meeting, Auntie Winyu praises Doris for a story about marriage, but admonishes Ifemelu for including a detail about a society woman that Auntie Winyu deems judgmental. Auntie Winyu leaves the meeting when her daughter arrives, and Ifemelu takes a call from Rani Nudo, during which Rani Nudo complains about Don. Esther enters the room, and Doris asks if she's feeling better. Doris had sent Esther to a clinic to get medicine. She's been given an antibiotic, but the label has only handwritten instructions and not the name of the drug. Ifemelu says they should write about this because improperly labeled medication is dangerous. Zemaye agrees. Doris says they aren't doing investigative journalism. Ifemelu begins to think about her blog in earnest and plans to write about important things instead of the vapid stories she writes for Zoe. Ifemelu decides to call her blog The Small Redemptions of Lagos. She plans to use a picture of the colonial house she can see from her apartment for the blog header. Ifemelu tells Doris and Zemaye that it doesn't make sense to running stories about society women. Doris tells her the society women pay Auntie Winyu to run the stories, which shocks Ifemelu. She and Doris argue, And Ifemelu leaves the office wondering if now would be a good time to quit her job and start her blog. At the beginning of chapter 50, Ifemelu invites Dike to visit. When he arrives in Lagos, he is excited to see that he is surrounded by black people. He has arrived one day after Ifemelu began her new blog and 1 week after she quit her job. Ifemelu writes blog posts, including one about the Nigerpolitan Club and the arrogance of people who return to Nigeria. When she writes a post about women who live expensive lifestyles they cannot afford on their own, Rainy Nudo is upset because she's sure people will know it's her that Ifemelu is writing about. She says Ifemelu is being judgmental and reminds her that she lived with a rich white man in America. Ifemelu takes the post down. Rainy Nudo suggests Ifemelu is emotionally frustrated and urges her to see Obinze. Dike moderates the blog comments while he is in Lagos, but sometimes has trouble with the Nigerian expressions and tells Ifemelu he wishes he spoke Igbo. She says he can still learn. When he asks her about his father, Ifemelu tells him the general loved him and his mother loved the general. She takes him to see the house at Dolphin Estate, which is now run down. Dike tells Ifemelu he likes Nigeria, and she almost asks him to stay. The next day, she takes him to the airport. In chapter 51, Ifemelu goes to the bank and again thinks she sees Obinze. She returns to her car and calls Obinze. She tells him she is in Nigeria and he asks if he can come to see her now. She says she is on her way to buy a book at Jazz Hole. He meets her there. The two talk for a long time. They talk about what each thinks has changed about Nigeria since they were young. Obinze says many of his friends have become fat. Ifemelu says she's gotten fat too, but Obinze tells her the added weight looks good on her. Ifemelu asks Obinze what has changed for him since he became wealthy. He says the biggest change is in the way people treat him. They suck up to him as though he expects it. Obinze says he sometimes feels nostalgic for his old lifestyle, but knows he wouldn't really want to return to it. Obinze mentions that Ifemelu doesn't have an American accent. She says she made an effort not to have one. He tells her he read her old blog posts and it didn't sound like her. Obinze says she's become more self-aware now and that her blog made him proud. They part ways and Obinze texts Ifemelu asking her to meet him for lunch the next day. The next day, Ifemelu and Obinze meet at her apartment. She points out the old colonial house to him and tells him there are often peacocks on the roof. She tells him it's the picture she has on her new blog. Obinze tells her that she needs investors for her blog, and she becomes defensive and says she doesn't want his money. Obinze soothes her and draws her attention to the peacocks that have flown up to the roof. Obinze asks what happened in America that made her stop contacting him. She tells him, and he holds her hand as she cries. She feels safe. In chapter 52, Obinze and Ifemelu continue to meet often. On one date, Ifemelu asks if Obinze has condoms in his pocket. The conversation devolves into an argument about Obinze having to return home to his wife every night. He tells her their relationship doesn't feel like cheating to him and leaves. He returns a few minutes later and apologizes. He tells her that he didn't like the way she'd made their relationship sound common and that what they have isn't about sex. They make love and Obinze leaves after she falls asleep. She wakes up to her phone ringing and it's Obinze asking if he can come see her again. In chapter 53, Ifemelu is giddy about her relationship with Obinze and looks forward to each new day. Obinze is careful to give his time with Ifemelu as much dignity as possible. However, one day as Obinze is cooking for Ifemelu, he mentions that he never gets to cook with Coxie. The mention of his wife upsets Ifemelu. He tells her he feels a responsibility for Kosi, but that is all. Obinze invites Ifemelu to go on a business trip with him, and she agrees. He later texts her and says he's changed his mind and that he needs to go alone so he can think. Obinze comes to her apartment and tells Ifemelu he feels like things are going to fast, and again tells her he has responsibilities. Ifemelu asks him what that means, and Obinze remains silent. At the start of chapter 54, Obinze is on his business trip alone. He fluctuates between thinking he's done the right thing by leaving Ifemelu behind and wishing she were there. When he completes his business meeting, he tries to call Ifemelu many times, but she doesn't answer. He fleetingly imagines she's with another man and feels queasy. When it's time for him to fly back to Lagos, he briefly considers buying a ticket to somewhere else, but knows he will do what is expected of him. As he gets on the plane, Kosi calls him to remind him they are taking Nigel out for his birthday. After he hangs up with Kosi, he thinks about how he and his wife never wanted the same things in life. He realizes he married Kosi at a time when he was newly rich and vulnerable to her beauty, and the things he was supposed to want. At Nigel's birthday party, Obinze is irritable and quibbles with Nigel over a floor plan. Obinze apologizes and he and Kosi go home. That night, Kosi cuddles up to him and offers sex. Obinze declines and thinks that he should tell Kosi he is in love with Ifemelu. The next morning, Obinze feels as though he hasn't rested. He goes about his duties as a husband and father, but feels sad the whole time. Finally, he tells Kosi he isn't happy and is in love with someone else. Kosi falls to her knees and begs him not to leave his family. Obinze learns that Kosi has known about his affair all along, which makes Obinze angry that she could know and pretend she didn't. He feels a sense of panic at the thought of remaining married and not being with Ifemelu. The next day, Kosi still expects Obinze to attend a christening with her. He goes, and as he watches Buchi, he hates the though of leaving her. Obinze's friends notice he is quiet, but Obinze says he's just tired. As Obinze is leaving the party, his friend Okwadiba asks if there is something wrong. Obinze tells him he wants to marry Ifemelu. Okwadiba tells him he shouldn't leave a wife he has no problem with just to be with another woman. In chapter 55, Ifemelu finally sees the male peacock dance, but the female peacock just walks away. She has been avoiding Obinze. Rani Nudo encourages her to date other men. Ifemelu continues to write her blog, and the pain of not having Obinze never goes away. But she is at peace because she is at home and has her blog. Ifemelu calls Blaine to say hello and tell him that she always felt like he was too good for her. The call feels stiff, but he does say he is glad she called. Then she calls Kurt, who is happy to hear from her. They speak on the phone a few more times after that, and he talks about visiting, but never does. One night, Ifemelu runs into Fred, and they have drinks. They see each other a few more times and eventually sleep together, but Ifemelu doesn't feel about him the way she wants to. Then, 7 months since the last time Ifemelu saw Obinze, he shows up at her door. Obinze tells her he wants to be with her and will continue chasing her until she gives him a chance. She invites him in.